Marc Bernier. News Talk
Mic's on.
50 WNDP.
Good evening from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University at the Captain Willie Miller Building, Gail Lemeron Auditorium. Welcome to the President's Speaker Series, a live town hall featuring Don Teague of CBS News, author of the book Saved by Her Enemy. This is a live radio broadcast on WNDB, and it's being streamed live on the internet at www.kennytv.com. You can click the icon at our website, marcberniershow.com. On behalf of President John Johnson, welcome to the beginning of our fall calendar of events. This week, Don Teague. Next week, Lee Sweell from the Fox News Channel. Then the first in our political presentations, a candidate for Congress, Republican Sandy Adams, will be here the week after that. Then John LeBoutelier from Newsmax.com. And on October 2nd, Dick Morris will be here to sign copies of his new book and participate in the town hall as well. And if you're listening to us live on radio, you still have an opportunity to visit us here at the campus of Embry-Riddle. We're here in the Captain Willie Miller Building, affectionately known by many on the campus as the IC Building, and you can join us in the audience. It is free and open to the public. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of President John Johnson and the staff of Embry-Riddle, let me introduce you to CBS News correspondent Don Teague.
Thanks for having me here.
Author of the book Saved by Her Enemy, and Don, thanks for flying in from Dallas. No stranger to a lot of flights. You've covered some big stories. No. You've got an audio and video scrapbook, I hope.
Yeah, I actually saw my first tornado in person yesterday in Dallas, too. If anyone saw the news and saw the tornado going across Dallas, I was on the freeway. I was one of those cars that stopped and had it pass right in front of me. Wow. It was a really surreal experience.
Watch for that clip on the Weather Channel. Don's an aviator here at an aviation university. Helicopter pilot, I believe, in the reserves as well. Tell us about that.
No longer, but I spent 11 years in the Reserve and National Guard, depending on where I lived at the time. I flew Hueys and OH-58s, and I miss it every day.
This story I found compelling, and why I asked Don to fly in from Dallas to talk about this. It's a story that I've never heard anything quite like this. A man who was called to journalism, has a family, a wife, Kiki, 2 daughters back in Dallas. They lived in Georgia at the time, I believe, the book started. You'd worked in local television, right, and then was hired by NBC News.
Yeah, just to make it confusing for everyone now, I've changed networks and cities and jobs since the book was written. But most of the book happens during the period when I was with NBC News.
This book is a story of a friendship that came in an area of the world you would not expect the friendship to happen, which is why we wanted Don to tell his story tonight. NBC News sent him to Iraq, I believe for the beginning of the Gulf War, the second round.
Right. Two major stints there. The first one was for the initial combat. I was really the first person for NBC into Kuwait during the whole buildup of the war, and then with the team of reporters we had there for the first 2 months or so of the fighting. And then this book really takes place during my second extended tour back there, which was the following February of 2004. When they asked me to go back, really just, at the time they had rotations of reporters that Richard Engel, who is the NBC correspondent who has really lived in Baghdad for most of the last 5 years, he can't stay there all the time. You have to get out. So what they would do is take normal people out of our lives, pluck us out and have us spell him for a time so he could get out and, sort of recharge his batteries. So I never considered myself a war correspondent. I'm a correspondent who was willing on occasion to go to a war, which I think there's a difference if you know any true war correspondents.
Before we get to the second person in this book, married to Kiki, 2 daughters, what's it like? We all have challenging jobs in our lives, but how many of us have a job in which we could go and be called to a war-torn area and not know if we're going to come back? What's that like in talking to your spouse and your daughters about, I've got to go back?
Yeah, it's not easy. People who, for good reason, people don't really think about journalists as people when they're watching them on the news or reading what they're writing in papers. But so many of us have families and have to leave those families to go and do these assignments. And for my wife in particular, well, her father was an Air Force pilot, so she grew up seeing her father going away all of the time, not knowing when he was coming back. She knew from my military experience that I had the same sort of dangers in that job. But in local news, you don't run into the same dangers you do as a network correspondent. I had no idea. I might not have taken the job had I known. It's kind of a joke. In local news, you're going to end up in the middle of riots sometimes, or in very tense situations, or in wildfires, things like that. But in network news, your phone could ring at any moment, and you can be sent anywhere in the world right into the middle of things that are very dangerous. And I find that for my wife and my daughters, that's always been very difficult.
So when you said you were going back for a second time, was there like, okay?
Yeah, it was. That's about how that conversation went. It was
because they asked you, and you said, "Let me talk to Kiki first,"
right,
and then you gave your answer to your network director.
Right, and really, I knew when NBC hired me that part of my job at that network was going to be to cover wars. I was hired right after September 11th. My military background was part of the reason, in my view, that they hired me. So I knew that this would be an assignment that would come up occasionally. So she knew that as well, and you know, we are people of faith. We pray about things like this. We prayed about it. We decided that was what we were supposed to be doing at the time, and off we went.
People ask me all the time, for the authors that we've had on for various programs, do you ever really read these books? I finished this book at 5:30 this morning. And the reason that I waited until the last 2 weeks before Don came was I wanted the information to be as fresh in my mind as possible. And Don and I spoke a few times over the last couple of weeks, and yesterday we were speaking, and he goes, "Have you gotten to where Raf goes to college yet?" And I said, "Not yet." He goes, "Well, I won't ruin it for you." And he didn't. Raf Barak is the other person in this book. She's a young lady raised in Iraq who faces death. Don faces death with her. Tell the folks the story of how you met.
Well, there's a reason the book is called Saved by Her Enemy, because I'm not her enemy. You are her enemy, all of you. She was raised really to fear and hate Americans. That may not be the way all Iraqis are raised. It's the way all Iraqis that she knew were raised. So when we were kids, most of us knew about the boogeyman. That's who you feared was hiding in the closet. She feared what her family called Mr. John. And Mr. John was the American hiding under the bed or in the shed out back. So it was no small thing for her to see her worst fears come true in her view, and see Americans suddenly taking over in her country. And then she made a decision that was really difficult for her, but she had no other choice. She's one of 11 children, and her parents and a niece and nephew who all lived in the same one-bedroom house in what we would really consider a slum in southern Baghdad. And they were getting by on about $75 a month, all of these people, before the war happened. When the war happened, the economy in Iraq collapsed, what there was of it, and there was no way for her family to support themselves, and their supplies were running low. Well, Raf had a skill, and her skill is that she speaks perfect English. She learned when she was in grade school. She excelled at that, so the Iraqi government sent her to Baghdad University to get a major in English literature, and it just so happens that NBC had come across her during that time and was aware of this young woman who spoke perfect English. So when the war happened, after a couple of months, she went and tried to get a job with the U.S. military as a translator. For various reasons in the book that we talk about, it didn't work out. She found herself working with NBC News. And she was one of the first people I met when I arrived there for this second tour. This young woman who was, covered up from head to toe. She looked to be 18 years old. It turns out she was 23 at the time. And brilliant. And really working outside of the mold of the way she had been defined by society.
In the book, for anyone who does buy this book and reads it, she is an expert at games, too, computer games, which surprised in the use of language.
Well, she hadn't been an expert at computer games until she started working for NBC. And what happened was there's a game called Text Twist. Is anyone familiar with this game? you spend a lot of time waiting for things to happen, or at least during my time there in Iraq. So we would sit around a table like this in the news bureau, and there's all these computers there. And one of the first ways I really got to know her was I saw her playing this game, Text Twist, and I thought, well, how hard is this going to be to beat an Iraqi? At this game, this is not her native language, and if you're not familiar with the game, letters come up and they're scrambled, and you have to make as many words out of these letters as possible, and there's a clock counting down while it's happening. And she would get words that I didn't know, and I had asked someone who held the record, because all of the NBC people there would play this game obsessively, sometimes for hours when you're just waiting for the next thing to happen. And she had the record by far, and I don't think I ever beat her.
Now, we're going to take you through a near-death experience for both the people of this book, and we'll tell you to fast forward. She is in this country right now, in the state of Florida. But first, the key part of this book that moved me was when you were both almost killed at the opening of a school. And I've seen the video of the bomb going off. I just saw it today. Take our listeners, viewers, and readers through what happened.
Well, part of my goal when I was there was to find stories of progress. So I had called the military and I said, look, I want to find something good happening. We cover bad things happening all the time. Surely there's some good. And they said, oh, yeah. There's this school that was bombed during the initial fighting, and we've rebuilt it better than new, and we're giving it back to the community. And we're going to have a little ceremony with cake and ice cream, and it'll be safe, and we'll escort you there, and why don't you come and see that? So we went, an NBC crew, a camera crew, producer, Rafraf was translating, and we spent a couple of hours at this school in, I think it was southwest Baghdad. And it was, as they said, a great day. There were happy Iraqi children running around. The school was beautiful. It looked like it was brand new. The teachers were saying things that we didn't really expect them to say, which was, we really didn't understand what America was all about until we saw these people come here and rebuild this school and give it back to us, and I think this is going a long way toward, improving things in this country. Well, okay, that's sort of what we were there expecting to see. Well, insurgents somehow knew this ceremony was happening that day, and as it turns out, they had planted 2 bombs right in the middle of all of this before we got there. So at whatever predetermined moment they had, while Rafraf and I were standing, we didn't have any of our body armor on because we were trying to be part of the relaxed atmosphere and not seem intimidating. So our security people said, take off all your body armor, don't wear your helmets, So,
and this is heavy stuff too, right?
Yeah.
This body armor is heavy stuff. Had it in the vehicle.
Right.
But somebody was missing their body armor.
Right. So we're standing out there doing this interview, and insurgents set the first of these bombs off. And it was shocking because it's kind of hard to tell you here in this room, but we were maybe 100 feet from this when it went off. And it was 10 pounds of C4, which is a very powerful plastic explosive. It would take this building out, right? And it was wrapped in there was a substance that they sort of dip this in, and then in that substance they embed nails and they wrap piano wire and just bits of metal just to make metal fly to kill people. And then they had dragged construction debris that was metal and glass on top of the place where they bombed it. So we were well within what would have been the kill zone of this bomb when it went off. But the person who dug the bomb dug the hole too deep. So the force of the blast, which went off right behind me, boom, it shot all of that shrapnel up in the air, and it rained it down around us instead of shooting it through our bodies. And therefore, we're alive. There was a second bomb that was planted right on the road where we had to turn to leave. And I'm not saying we were the targets necessarily, but they knew the media was there, they knew the military was there, they were just as happy to kill children and teachers. It was just a target-rich environment to set off a couple of bombs. And they tried to set the other one off as we were making our escape, and it misfired. The military found it when they went back later that day and did an investigation. And I remember the guy telling me on the phone how lucky we were, and I agreed.
And you didn't have your body armor. She didn't have her body armor, so you gave her yours and kind of had to crouch because you had no other protection.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, we crawl back to the vehicles and we're trying to leave, and I jump in and I'm pulling everyone's armor out and the helmets and everything, and we all put it on, and I look at Ruff, and she's standing there without it, and I said, where is your body armor? Because we knew that as soon as we left, something bad was going to happen. Either they were going to start shooting at us, because that was the MO at the time, was ambushes after the first bomb. And she said, well, I didn't know we were working today, which was true. This had been something that I set up sort of last minute, and she came in to work on it with me. So I felt, responsible for her being there. I was responsible for her being there. So I wasn't going to be able to live with myself if, she died. So I gave her my vest, but then to prove that it wasn't my shining moment of heroism, I said, I'm hiding behind you. When we leave, I'm going to get down in the truck, so, oh well,
We're talking with Don Teague. He's the author of the book Saved by Her Enemy, and we'll take a few phone calls, too, in the time that we have with Don a little bit later at 239-0033, AT&T star 1150, and Linnell from the President's Office is going to also mic people in the audience who may have a question or want to make a comment to Don Teague here in this very, very special presentation. Something that hit me in this book, too, was her opinion of George Bush kind of reminded me of the way many Americans looked at Saddam Hussein. Do I understand, Don, did I read correctly that there are many people who just thought that Iraq would have been better off leaving Saddam in place because at least you knew what you were getting?
Well, that's what she thought. And when you read the book, you will discover that she, if you meet her today, you won't recognize her as the woman that I met back in 2004, because her view of the world was entirely shaped by what Saddam Hussein had allowed her view to be. She had never seen the internet, ever. She was graduating college and had never seen the internet. She had never seen satellite TV or newspapers or anything that wasn't allowed by the government. So you didn't really have a good idea of what the rest of the world was really like. And we had a conversation one day where we're talking, and I knew how sad she was because this is her home. We think of it as this far-off, dangerous land. This is just her home in her city. And all of her life has been thrown into turmoil. And I said, look, I know how difficult this is, but isn't there some positive for the fact that Saddam Hussein is not here? He threw your father in prison for something he didn't do. He killed people that you knew, used rape and torture as political tools. And she said, well, he's not doing anything different than every other president. And I said, well, no, he was. You can't just do things like that. And she said, no, surely George Bush does the same thing in your country. If people talk bad about them, he has them killed. And I said, no, people have marches in the street. They make movies about how much they don't like him. That's your right in our country to speak out against the president if you want.
Did she believe you when you
went to? No, she thought I was lying. She thought that George Bush was just the next Saddam Hussein. And what she saw with her eyes seemed to validate that. And the reason is because of things that make sense to us. The U.S. military moves in. They say, well, we have to set up bases. We have to be somewhere. We don't want to kick people out of their homes. Look at these presidential palaces. They're empty and they're fortified. We'll move into those. But in her view, that's, see, we told you, you kick out our dictator and you're just moving in another one who's going to do the same things. So there's a disconnect between what we consider the reality of the situation and the way she viewed it and many other Iraqis did.
I know that some of our listeners, viewers, and participants here tonight are thinking the same thing that I was thinking. What is it like? She shared this with you. What's it like for people what do they think of their own people who are trying to kill them? I mean, insurgents, what do they think? That it's a necessary evil? This is the fallout from no Saddam? How do they justify it in their minds?
She didn't justify it, and her family doesn't justify it. She was not a supporter of the insurgency in any way. What I found there, and again, my last time in Iraq was 2004, but at the time, many of the people I spoke with there had the same view, which was, thanks a lot. We appreciate you getting rid of Saddam. We'd kind of like you to leave now, but don't leave too soon. Please handle these people first, right? That's sort of simplifying the situation, but that's the way most of them felt. Most of them weren't anti-American in the sort of big picture. They didn't want to kill us. There was just a very small number, but that small number, was armed and trained and ready to die and kill innocent people. So, and obviously that's still going on today.
We are also going to talk a little bit about some other stories that Don has covered, but to advance forward, there is a point in which you're going to come home. Help tell the story about how Raf comes to this country.
Well, after the bombing, Raf and I became friends. We worked together every day during this time in Iraq. The bombing happened about 2 weeks before I was supposed to go home. And it just occurred to me that I was going to get to go home, and she was home, and it wasn't going to get any better for her. And you probably know this already, but there's never been a war more dangerous for journalists than Iraq. More journalists have been killed in Iraq than all other wars combined. It's even more dangerous for translators who are working with journalists because they are specifically hunted down and murdered by insurgents for working with Americans, because they don't draw a distinction between journalists, the military, contractors. If you're working with an American company, you're a traitor as far as the insurgents are concerned. And she had popped up on their radar. They were aware that she was working with NBC. Our security people had become aware of a plot to kill her. And in fact, shortly after I left, she was kidnapped. And through really bravery on her part, she managed to escape before they took her wherever they were taking her. But it was clear to me that she wasn't going to survive if she kept doing the job, and I also knew she wasn't going to quit the job, because for the first time she was gaining exposure to the outside world, and she's a very intelligent young woman, and she was hungry to know what the rest of the world was. Even though she didn't necessarily believe it, she was starting to believe. And on top of that, her family needed the money. And just to give you a little background, I said that they were getting by on about $75 a month. A school teacher at the time, a police officer at the time, right before the war, made about $5 a month. That was an Iraqi's salary. So the economy was based on very small numbers. NBC was paying her $1,000 a month. She was supporting her entire family, extended family. She had money to buy shoes. She was not going to quit that job, but she was going to die doing it, and I was convinced of that, and so were many of my colleagues there.
Was there resentment from her father or mother or family that she was making this kind of money because of the old world style of living?
Not initially. There became some issues with her father because he started hearing back talk from other relatives. You're not controlling your daughter. Look at her. She runs around with Americans. She buys these things, and he actually tried to get her to quit, and she wouldn't do it. And it was shortly after that, the day at the school with the bombing, though, when I made what really is an awkward phone call, when you call your wife from a foreign country and you say, I've met this girl, and I'm thinking of bringing her home. What do you say? And
yeah, you know what? When I read that, I went, wait a minute. What was it like? I mean, well, you had told her you were working with her anyway.
Right.
So.
Obviously, my wife knows me. She knew the situation. And when I explained to her, I said, she's not going to survive what she's doing here. It's clear. Then my wife said, if there's a way we can help her get out, then absolutely we'll do whatever it can. We can. And that led to what was really 7 months of a real full-time struggle between myself, Raf, several of my colleagues to try to find a way to get her out of that country. In 2004, I think there were a dozen or so Iraqis total who came from Iraq into the U.S. It was very difficult to do. And we finally did manage to get her out of the country and bring her to the U.S. And that's really where the book was supposed to begin, because it was really eye-opening to watch her begin to see what this country is all about. You know, as an American, we take so many things for granted. But when you take someone who has had only fear and hatred of this country, bring them here, this is someone who's never been allowed to go on a date, never been allowed to make any decisions on her own, was frequently beaten for speaking to a member of the opposite sex. The only time those rules were suspended was when she was working with us. As soon as she left the office and went home, if she had a 10-second conversation at a bus stop with a male, she would be beaten for that. And then to suddenly come and be a part of my family, where my wife and I say, look, you're an adult here. You're going to make your own decisions. We're not going to tell you what you can and can't do. We're going to try to give you advice and help you, but those decisions are yours. It was hilarious and painful to watch.
And for anyone who reads this book, you're going to get that sense, because you're not her parents, yet she's coming to your home. You have two teenage daughters. She hadn't experienced a lot of Americanisms, I should say,
right.
And as a result, she starts dressing up to go out. Take it.
Yeah, she didn't wear a lot of clothing. Now this is a woman who had been covered from head to toe the whole time I had known her, with the traditional scarf, which is the way the Iraqis wear it, is very tight. You do see their face, but just their faces. And she had lived with us for about a week, and I saw that scarf every day. And my wife mentioned to me one day, she said, you know, as soon as you leave the house, she takes that scarf off. Because she said she hates it. It makes her head hurt, and it's hot and all this. And I said, well, why does she, she doesn't have to wear it. And it turns out that it was out of respect for my wife, because, I'm a member of the opposite sex. And so my wife said, look, if you take your scarf off when you're at home with your family, this is your family. You don't have to wear it. So that was the first sort of piece that fell. And then within weeks, we had to have another conversation about, put some clothes on, young woman, before you leave the house. That's not appropriate.
Out of curiosity, coming to live with the Teague family, was there worry about reprisal to her family in Iraq that remained behind?
There was some concern about that. Her family, the insurgents already knew where she lived. They already knew about a brother that she has who was a police officer, and another sister. And it was actually to the point where her family was forced to move from their neighborhood. A group came of militants and said, we run this neighborhood now. We don't approve of your family. Get out or die. And they all scattered around Iraq. Her mother ended up going back a couple of years later, and they're now back in that family home.
Okay, so in working a deal with NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders, you guys worked very closely together. I guess either you or Kerry or both of you came up with this plan to raise $60,000 to pay for her education. Is that how you were able to get her into the country? Because you didn't have $60,000 lying around.
No, it's a great mystery that will never be revealed how we managed to get her into the country. But it was all legal. But keeping her here, once we got her here, keeping her in the legal visa status, because when she came it was under a short-term visa. The only way to keep her here was to get her in school, and for foreign students to come to a university, you have to prove the ability to pay. You have to have the money in hand, basically, and she's from a family with no money. So we set out to raise money to put her in school, and we did. We raised it. It actually turned out to be $70,000 in a period of just a few months from strangers. If you were unfortunate enough to sit next to me on an airplane,
Yeah.
I'd say, "Hi, nice to meet you. I want to tell you a story." And then it would end with me handing you an envelope and saying, if you want to help, send the money to this fellowship at the University of South Florida. And then many of our colleagues, many people you see on TV every day, I can say 2 of the 3 primary network anchors right now, a lot of people donated to help Rafraf get here.
All right, so she lives with the Teague family for 2 years?
Well, it's been about 2.5 years, but off and on, as many college students are. She lived with us for the first year before going to college, and then she's been back with us since then for periods between classes and things like that.
And then also lived with Carrie Sanders' family for a time, or would visit for the holidays?
Yeah, she would just go visit Carrie. Carrie's an NBC News correspondent and a great guy. He's based here in Miami, and he and his wife became friends with Raf. Well, he became friends with Rafraf because he had worked with her too, and he was instrumental in so many ways in figuring out how to get her out of the country and get her into school here. And it was also part of her learning about the world, because she had very along with hating Americans, part of the reason she hated Americans was because of our support for Israel as a nation. And we had a conversation one day where she's telling me, and this is early on, about why it's normal to hate Jews and why they don't think anything of it. And I said, well, look, this is a new world in this country, and while we've had problems in the past as a nation, we're hardly perfect people, but in my view, it's not a country built on hating anyone. So you're going to have to get over that. And she hadn't really gotten over that until she was going. It was the first Christmas she was here, and she was going to stay with Carrie Sanders and his wife for Christmas. Well, right before leaving, someone mentioned to her at a school event that she was with my daughters. He said, "Oh, are you looking forward to your first Christmas?" And I said, "Well, I think it's going to be her first Hanukkah, because she's going to stay with a friend in Florida, and he's Jewish." And she almost fell down and passed out. And she looked at me and she's like, "Who?" I said, Carrie Sanders. He's Jewish. "You didn't know that?" She had no clue at all. And here was someone that she knew had done everything he possibly could to help her. And she wasn't going to go. She said, "I can't go and be in a Jew's house." And I said, "Again, we're not like that here. You can't be that way." And then my wife had a talk with her, and she finally, on her own, decided to go. And it was a life-changing experience for her to realize. And as it turns out, and I should say, I don't talk about people's religions. I've spoken with Carrie about this before. Any of it was in the book. Carrie is from a Jewish background. His father was Jewish, but he's actually a Christian. So it was Christmas after all that she went there for. But it was sort of the first. It was the first real realization that maybe so many of these things that she thought she knew weren't really right. And then she learned that some of the other people that she had considered friends that she had worked with in Iraq were Jewish, that worked for NBC. And she's like, "Well, why didn't I know this?" I said, "Well, you don't announce while you're working in Iraq that you're Jewish. So it's been a big learning curve for her."
One of the reasons I found the story so compelling and wanted Don to tell it is we go through our lives every day, and we take things for granted. The job we go to, the life we have, our family. We take for granted sometimes our health. And here's a case where in another part of the world, an American befriends someone who didn't have any basis for the normal. Everything was opposite. You and your wife and 2 daughters were living in Atlanta, the Atlanta
Right.
area. And then suddenly NBC moves you to Dallas? Is this while Rafraf was living with you?
It was right as she was going to college. So right when she moved into the dorms at the University of South Florida is when we were moving across to Dallas.
Okay. So here is a young lady. She is going to USF, and she meets a woman who is a Marine who has been sent back. She was injured in Iraq.
Right.
And was she a student at USF?
I don't know if she was a student at USF before this happened. Her name's Mary Catherine Mason, and I'm now going to embarrass her by pointing her out. She's in the second row right here. And although I've written about her in the book and talked to her on the phone, this is the first time we've met was today, so it was great to finally meet her.
Wow. Welcome.
Rafraf, she goes through this evolution where she's learning about America. She's starting to experience a free country from a standpoint of someone who hated this country, and she's starting to embrace it. And one of her greatest fears had been Americans, American soldiers in particular, and Marines, which of course aren't soldiers. And the first thing she saw when the U.S. came into Baghdad was Marine Corps tanks rolling down the street past her road, the U.S. Marines. And it was an image that was so frightening to her. We write about it in the book. She collapses on her rooftop. They have flat roofs, so she watched the tanks roll in and just cried. And fast forward about 2 years, she moves into her dorm at the University of South Florida. Her roommate, who she has never met, the first thing she does when she walks in is she sees that crimson Marine flag hanging on the wall. And this young woman, who was a Marine and was injured, was it Nasiriyah? And couldn't continue with her unit, so they sent her home for surgery and rehabilitation and everything else and let her go back to school. And just by, a miracle of logistics or whatever, Mary Catherine and Rafraf become roommates in a dorm in college, which is just, just an amazing thing, really. And another part of Rafraf's evolution, I think, as an American, to realize that our soldiers and Marines are people. I mean, she's a real person. Look at her. I didn't know that till I met her today.
And I didn't know when I greeted you and came in that was you. This is a surprise. They have mystery dinners. How about a mystery event? One of the participants in the book is here. I hope you don't mind if I ask Don to tell the story about the hanging carpet.
Oh, well, there was when Rafraf walked into the dorm, initially there was what she didn't know was what Mary Catherine didn't know was a prayer rug that she had put as a doormat. But she didn't know it was a prayer rug. She just bought this beautiful, colorful rug when she was over there and had it as a souvenir, and it was in her dorm. So, the first thing Rafraf does, he walks in, sees a Marine Corps flag, and steps on a prayer rug. Not an auspicious beginning for a relationship, but you moved the rug, though, right? There you go.
Did you offer her a hot dog or anything like that? No. Okay. Offer her a beer. And Iraqis do not drink alcohol at all, correct? Or
right.
They're not supposed to anyway.
Right.
But you became close, and we're going to bring a microphone to you because we want you to tell the story here. And we've got about a minute before our radio audience leaves for football. What was the biggest, I want them to hear this in about the minute here that we have before that break, the biggest impression that this young lady made upon you, Rafraf, and all the time? Was it the bigness of her heart? Was it how smart she was?
She's very intelligent. She has a photographic memory. I don't know that it's been proven by testing, but it's clear from knowing her. But the thing that struck me about her beyond that is her courage, because she's not a big woman. She's 5'3", and from a country and a culture that hasn't allowed her to make decisions. She wasn't at all prepared to live as an American at all. But she has so much courage to first be able to leave all that behind, leave her family, which she may never see her family again. And because she had to, in one sense, for her own safety, and she recognized that, but because she knows there's another world out there and she wanted to see what that was. It really took a lot of courage on her part.
For our radio audience to hear the rest of what we're talking about, go live on the internet, www.kennytv.com. And, of course, the full program will be broadcast on Bookmark within the coming weeks and be replayed in the Best of Bernier. For our radio audience, thank you so much for listening. For Don Teague, the author of the book Saved by Her Enemy, and enjoy the football game. We'll be back tomorrow. For the rest of you, we continue. You've covered some big stories in your time with NBC and CBS. You trained at Fort Hood.
I did. Not in a lengthy way, but when I was in the reserves, I was in a unit in Dallas for a while. So our primary training base where we would go for our 2 weeks of training and weekend drills and everything else was Fort Hood. So I knew the post pretty well.
I watched your video this afternoon and doing some show prep for today. You covered that story. What was that like?
You know, it was. It's obviously heartbreaking and something that you don't expect to happen. Obviously, we're talking about the shooting at Fort Hood last November, and it's just hard to wrap your head around. It's hard. I mean, never mind all of the world political and religious dynamics and all of those things, but just that a soldier would do this to other soldiers who are defenseless was really a hard thing to see. And what's interesting is, you know, most people who don't go onto military bases often assume that there are guns everywhere. There are not guns everywhere on a military base. In fact, there are guns nowhere. So everyone is unarmed except the military police. And of course, Major Hassan would know that. So,
in the piece that you filed, you see the artist's conception, the mechanical they put together, of how he walked in and opened fire. 13 killed, 30 injured, I believe, and the whole world became upside down. That's the largest training base in the country, is it not, Don?
I think so, yeah. It's. I used to know the exact acreage, 92,000 sticking in my head, but that may be Fort Sill. So right. I used to fly at both of those places, but it's huge and sprawling.
You had already moved to Texas at the time, so when you get the call from your news director saying, we need you over there to do this, how far is this travel for you? Yeah,
actually, that was one of those things. You know, somebody asked me just the other day, I was flying to a story, and here I am sitting in coach, and they say, what do you do? Oh, I work for CBS. Don't they fly you around on private jets? No. I'm in coach in the back. And that was one of the few instances where they did. They actually chartered a helicopter because there was no way to get from where we were down to Fort Hood. It was impossible to get there in time to be on the evening news with Katie Couric by that evening. So it was a pretty hectic flight down there.
Was this emotionally charging for you to go back to the very camp that you trained at to have to report on this horrific incident?
You know, my problem as a reporter, and it is a problem, I guess, is that I get emotionally involved with, I mean, clearly I brought an Iraqi home. So it's not easy for me to separate sort of the reality from the TV reality. And it's not a bad thing to have that separation. It's the same thing that police officers do, because you couldn't function when you see the sorts of horrific things that you see if you weren't able to somehow make it not real to a certain extent. I had the same problem at Katrina. I was there, you know, before, during, and then 3 weeks after the storm. But again, I say it's a problem. It's all of my colleagues were going through the same thing during Katrina. I don't know anyone who didn't end their day crying or spend their time, as soon as they were finished doing their job for the day, literally all of the people I worked with would load up SUVs and drive block to block looking for people to give food and water to help. So you don't see that on TV, but that's the kind of people that I have come across in the business.
I want to remind our audience here at Embry-Riddle that if you have a question for Don, start thinking about those questions, and then we'll call for Linnell from the President's office to mic you so that you can ask your question directly of Don. We're going to do that in the next moment or so, so be thinking of your question for Don Teague. Before we get to Katrina, one exit question on Fort Hood. Has that changed, do you think, the way that we approach military training or run bases, or is it just it happened? Do you think anything changed in how we run bases or how we treat people as a result of this?
I don't think anything has changed yet from it. And there are certain specific things. There have been talk, and I think there have even been bills put forward that would allow military people who have, say, if they have a concealed handgun license off post, to let them have it on post as well. I don't think there's been any movement on those things. I don't know what the answer is as far as how do you identify someone. I mean, we saw in so many ways in that case where the system failed to point out Major Hassan and his danger to the people around him, which in 2020 hindsight everyone seemed to see, but for whatever reason didn't come forward beforehand. I don't know if that's been fixed. I don't know what the solution is really.
Don Teague is our guest from CBS News correspondent, who is the author of the book Saved by Her Enemy. Now, Katrina, it's hard to imagine that you're living in the United States with what you and your colleagues saw. Was that coming through your mind as you had to walk through the water and see the bodies and the people? I feel like I'm on another planet. I feel like I'm in another country. How could this happen to our people?
I mean, clearly, it's not something that it's surreal, and it's not something that you expect to happen. When you start engaging the sort of logical side of your brain, you're making sense of it. Well, we're in a bowl. It's cut off. The people here, it's hard. You can't get people in just yet to help. I mean, you're coming up with all these reasons why this is happening, but none of it makes sense with what you're seeing, which is, why can't we get these people out of here? Why can't we get them help? Why is this still happening?
One of the stories we said we would cover, too, in this discussion before we go to questions from the audience was you also covered the oil spill in the Gulf recently. Do Americans really have an understanding of what happened there? Like when you're there covering it as a reporter, it's entirely different from what Americans may think happened.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what Americans think happened. But I have a feeling that most people followed that pretty closely. I can tell you that the people it really affected, the people who lived in Louisiana, it's a real conflict for them there because those oil and fishing are the lifeblood of that area, and they've gotten along really well beforehand. So it was an interesting dynamic to see the fishing community there, where you may have a family where two brothers are fishermen and one of them works on an oil platform, where now all of a sudden they're having this animosity toward this particular industry. But I don't know that it's industry-wide. I think it was, that company, it was easy in their case to sort of say, look what these people have done, they need to fix it.
The impression that we as viewers got, at least my radio listeners were sharing with me, Don, was the government was really slow on the uptake on this. They underestimated the vastness of this problem. Did that shine through to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that the administration said that from the beginning it was one of their top priorities. It's not something we necessarily see on the ground, or on the water. So I guess I don't know how to answer the question.
Okay. You also have covered some of the hurricane activity that's threatened the east coast of the United States recently, and I think when I spoke with you on the phone in the last few weeks, you had just come back from flying out. I talked to my dad in Rhode Island last night, and he said, they got us all worked up. He's an old New England Yankee. Got us all worked up, and we only had a little bit of rain. That was it. It was sounding like it was going to be really bad for South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina.
Yeah. I never thought so. I was convinced because I every day of my life here's the job. When you're based in Dallas as a correspondent for the network, your life goes in seasons, and the seasons are early tornado season, early fire season, late tornado season, early hurricane season, late hurricane season, late tornado season, late firestorm season, early ice storm season. Okay, weather events that happen across from the Midwest down through Texas affect my life on an almost daily basis. So I'm very well in tuned in watching those hurricanes. I'm one of the people who's watching the discussions from the National Hurricane Center of what might form 6 days from now. They never really thought Earl was going to come ashore, but it just kept getting closer and closer and closer and bigger. Thankfully, it didn't. I was just, what was the hurricane we just had? It wasn't Hermine. Hermine. Right, I was just down in South Padre Island for that, and then yesterday covered the flooding for that, and then saw the tornado that it spun off as I was driving. I was literally driving home from the evening news live shot, and there was the tornado. And I would be doing it today if I wasn't here.
Let's hear from you in the audience. If you have a question for Don, raise your hand. Linnell is working through the audience. She'll come to you, ask you to be brief, and she'll come to you as quickly as possible. You can ask your question directly of Don. Give us your first name, please, and just ask the question. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you. My name is Chris, and I've two questions. First of all, Rafraf, was she Shia or Sunni? And secondly, what is she doing today? Is she employed, or
Right.
What's her chosen profession?
She was technically Shia, but her parents were actually one Shia and one Sunni, but her father was a Shia, so they were raised as a Shia. But because of this influence of her mother, they really just sort of considered themselves Muslim, which is rare, as you know, there with so much discord between Shia and Sunni. They sort of were content to be either, if that makes sense. What was the second part of your question?
What is she doing now?
Yeah, she lives in Tampa, and she has finished most of the coursework for her master's degree. She's now been given political asylum, which has gone from that to a green card, and she's actually on the path to citizenship now. So there's not as much, she doesn't have to be in school anymore. But of course she wants to finish the master's degree. She has to write her thesis, and she has to take like one more elective, and she'll be done with that.
Through the audience, if you have a question for Don, raise your hand and Linnell will find you. While I wait for Linnell to get in place, if you were asked to go back to Iraq, would you go?
Whether I would or not is not as much the question as whether my wife would let me go. Because we decided that this was a two-person deal, and she pretty much said after the bomb last time that I wasn't going back. So I haven't been back, and they haven't. With CBS, it's not really part of my job, so it may not come up. Thanks for raising it, though.
let's go. Anyone in the audience here? Because I'll go back and forth. Thank you, Dean. Your question.
Being rather positive in outlook and subscribing to, I guess, the Winston Churchill motto, never, ever, ever give up, could you philosophize about your hopes and your thoughts of success in winning the hearts and minds of people in Iraq and Afghanistan and,
Sure.
and the future?
Well, you know, I'm an American, and I believe that freedom goes a long way toward winning hearts and minds. And from seeing Rafraf embrace the freedoms that she was given once she understood them, I believe that, look, I don't think it's something that, it's not necessarily ethnic or cultural or racial, that somehow we can enjoy freedom but others can't. I've heard people say that, oh, those people have been fighting all these years, they'll never get along. I don't believe that. I think when you, there are sometimes dynamics that you have to overcome of, you know, brutal leaders who are not going to give up what they've got, and, you know, infighting from warlords or whatnot. But ultimately, what I learned from Rafraf and from this journey that we've been on together is that I think humans sort of want the same things, which is freedom to be what we want to be in our lives, to care for our families, to move forward and make decisions for ourselves, and to sort of be left alone. So I guess it's misplaced optimism sometimes, because I was optimistic in Iraq 5 years ago. I was telling Rafraf, oh, you'll be back a year from now, it'll all be better. So it doesn't mean I'm right all the time, but I'm still optimistic that when you expose people to democracy and freedom, that eventually they realize that that's not a bad way to be. So.
I want to hear from Mary Catherine in just a second, but first, Bennett, you have a question for our guest. Go ahead.
Yes, how can I volunteer to go over there? I tried to join the Marines the day after 9/11, and they said I was too old at 43. And you're looking at pictures of my Uncle Richard, who was in Patton's Third Army, 6th Cavalry. He revived Jews at Buchenwald. He just passed away 2 months ago. How do I get involved? And I want to know, I represent thousands of Americans that are Jeffersonians. We had to disassociate ourselves from the Republican Party. And you mentioned that your gal that you helped thought of Bush as a dictator. Well, look at some of the things like the what's that act, the Homeland Security Act, and some of these things. Go back to Abraham Lincoln, how he suspended the Constitution. Jefferson said when we
Hold on. I'm going way off the track here.
Sorry.
I got to sort of bring this back.
Thank you.
He raised a valuable point, though. There are Americans in their 40s who want to serve. Correct me if I'm wrong, during your first or second tour, didn't they make it easier for Americans who are physically fit in their 40s to serve our resolve in Iraq?
I believe, but I can't tell you that I know what the actual regulations are. I can tell you, interestingly, that Rafraf has been toying with that idea of serving somehow as well, because she feels the need to give back to this country after what she feels she's been given. I can also say that as far as the Iraqis, one of the issues there have been tens of thousands of Iraqis who have worked with U.S. military as translators, and these are people who've put their lives on the line, and hundreds of them have been murdered, maybe thousands, but they don't really have a good count on people who were specifically murdered for being translators. But there's a concern about now what happens to them when the U.S. troops who've been protecting them leave. And there is a nonprofit called the List Project, which what they concern themselves with is trying to help Iraqis who have helped us come here legally. So
to volunteer, and then maybe eventually somebody might throw some education at me. I sat in this chair almost 8.5 years ago, and I still can't finish my college education at Embry-Riddle. I went through 7 years of apprenticeship. I even put the motor in over here at the Mobile, over at the new computer room with Giles Electric. I mean, I've done everything I can, and I still can't finish education. I've got all kinds of doors slammed in my face. I guess because I'm just a complainer. I don't know.
We hear this a lot, where people want to make a contribution and they can't. They're still searching. But I've heard that there are many groups that have been formulated since the Iraqi war that are trying to help Americans to get back into business, to get into industry, and to also for the treatment of their injuries. Did you see a lot of Americans as well as Iraqi citizens injured during your reporting?
I mean, you see people who clearly bear the scars of war, amputees and things like that. They're there and part of the society. I've been to the medical center in San Antonio, the Army Medical Center there, and seen the troops, going through rehabilitation and things like that. I mean, you're very aware of it. In fact, those images are the things that I was thinking about when I was there. More so than dying is this fear of being, disfigured by these bombs, which go off all the time. And we've had so many thousands of troops now who are dealing with these injuries. So, you don't see the troops, though, when you're there. You see the Iraqi people. Because the troops who are injured are gone. So,
one of the reasons that Don agreed to come here is because he's a fan of Embry-Riddle's. And I think you've met a few people over your career that actually went to school here and are now serving the military.
Yeah, people that I served with in the Army, in the reserves. Embry-Riddle is a part of that aviation and military community. There's a lot of mixing there, so I always had a high opinion of it. So,
I want to ask Mary Catherine, I know you're not here to be on the program, but I got to ask you, when Rafraf came to live with you, you guys became very close and very, according in this book, good friends. How does she become more of an American in hanging out with you? You girls would go places. I think it was Don. You wrote in the book that because she was a very pretty girl, it was great to go hang out with her because there would always be a lot of people that wanted to come around to meet her.
It was very easy. She was very Americanized very quickly. I mean, she acted like an American from the get-go. Not shy at all. She definitely dressed a little bit more shorter clothing than I did, or the roommates. We had a German exchange student. We had her being from Iraq, and 2 of us were from Florida. But she was very mysterious looking. No one could pick where she's from. Everyone thought she was Latina. She does speak Spanish, which did help her. But
you thought she was Cuban at first?
I don't even remember what I thought she was. I had no idea. Well, she said her name was Roff Roff, and I said, what is that? Where are you from?
The funny thing is, here in Florida, people will address her in Spanish because they assume she's either Cuban or maybe from Mexico or somewhere.
Yeah.
And she'll answer back in English, and she's actually had people lecture her about, well, you're not speaking your native language, how dare you? And then she answers in Arabic, and they look at her like, what?
We attempted to have Raf on this presentation, but she has a job in South Florida, and the time that we were doing this presentation did not allow for her to be able to take a break to participate even by phone. We hope to talk with her again in the future. Did she have any trepidation about having her story portrayed in a book?
Sure. We both did initially. My concerns were that I never had planned on doing this as a book because I didn't want her to think there was some other reason that we were opening our home to her and doing all of this to help her, and then, oh, here comes the other shoe drop. We're making a movie about your life, or whatever it is. But we get to this point after years, I guess it was 3 years that she had been here, where over and over and over people who hear the story say, well, you have to write that. People need to hear about this story. And so I sat down and talked with her, and I said, what do you think? It turns out that she was more in favor of doing it than I knew. So she was actually thrilled. But there have been concerns. We changed a lot of the names in the book of real people, particularly people who are still in Iraq, to protect them and provide some separation for any sort of troubles that could come up, but thankfully there haven't been any.
For the benefit of our audience here, as well as those watching us on the internet, Don is going to be signing copies of his book in the next few minutes. Our partners at our university bookstore are right here. They have the books. If you'd like to purchase a copy, Don will be glad to sign it for you. In addition, for those of you who watch this at a later date, you can obtain copies of this book from the university bookstore here on campus at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. For your daughters, I didn't really ask you about the daughters aspect of it. What were they thinking, or what did they express to you about you bringing this young lady home from Iraq to their family? Dad's been gone, and
right.
Now he's home, and he's bringing this girl home.
They were both, I think they were 10 and 12 at the time, and we have this pattern, my wife and I, of bringing strange people into our house. So it's not really the first time that this has happened. It's the first time someone from another country like this, but her little sister, my wife's little sister, had come to live with us for a year and a half or so, and we had strangers. There have been people that I met on stories who didn't have a place to live, and they'd end up in our house for a couple of days, while they were passing through a city or whatever. So my kids weren't too freaked out by that, but it is a huge culture shock. As much as Raf had this culture shock of coming to this family where she knows nothing about our culture, we've got dogs in the house. She was terrified of dogs.
Oh, tell the story about the dog's name. The dog's name.
Yeah.
Which
she comes into the house, and the first thing she hears, my wife comes in, and the dogs all take off, and my wife starts yelling, "Sunni! Sunni!" and Ruff is just like frozen in fear because in her country, dogs, they roam the street and they bite and they're mean and they're not pets. And then now they've got this one trained to attack on command when you yell Sunni. Well, he was a Japanese dog, a Shiba Inu, and his name is Tsunami. But we had always just called him Sunni and didn't think anything of it. And now here comes the Shia in the house, and you're screaming Sunni as this dog's jumping on her. So that was an adjustment for her, but she figured that out. It turns out she's a cat person, which we're not. So,
Any other questions from the audience before I ask the big question? Okay. Anyone? Show of hands. Yes, right here in the front.
I should tell you one other thing. My oldest daughter is now 18, and she's starting college right now, and she's decided to minor in Arabic because she was so fascinated from knowing Rafraf and learning about her culture. So now she's trying to learn Arabic.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for coming. It's very interesting, and I love the book.
Thank you.
You said that she's not been able to go back to see her family. Does she have any desire to go back?
She does. She misses her mom. Well, her father died a few months ago, suddenly, not war-related. So now she really has a strong desire to go home and be with her mom and comfort her, and she can't. She can't go back right now. It's too dangerous. It's much more dangerous for her. I mean, look, here's her picture on the cover of a book. And as you know from reading the book, she has become a Christian now. So she's got all of that. There have been people who have, threatened her. And so it's very difficult for her to not be able to go home, not be able to see her mom. But she still has hope that someday she will.
Let's go to the audience, because that question is even more important than what I'm going to ask. Go ahead, sir. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Dave, I'm a Homeland Security student here at Embry-Riddle, and having lived events that we study on a daily basis, what advice would you give to somebody who's going to a field of federal law enforcement or any field like that and is going to incur the aftermath of this?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for doing that. Advice for going into it. I think it's the same advice that I would have for journalists, which is know that what you're doing is important for the people that you're interacting with. Because so many times, my assignment for the day is to go interview you about whatever. I may not remember it 2 days from now. I may not remember we had this discussion. But you wouldn't be taking your time to be interviewed and want to tell this story, which is often painful. You may be talking about the death of a loved one or whatnot, unless it was important to you. So I need to not just pretend it's important, but recognize that it's important. And I think that for someone in law enforcement, Homeland Security, the military, it's the same thing. You're doing a job, but your job actually impacts people's lives and the people you're interacting with on a daily basis. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
So,
I get what you're saying. You're saying that our job is important, but at the same time, like you're kind of saying, we can't take all of that home with us constantly and just kind of let it sit on our shoulders.
Well, yes, and at the same time, know that what you're doing is important and recognize that so that the people that you're interacting with get that. You know what I mean? I'll talk to people all the time. When people have had a good experience with a police officer, they talk about that good experience for years, just because somebody treated them in a more human way than they might have expected. So I guess that's part of it.
Finally, television has a habit of spitting out talent with the veracity of a gumball machine. I read that one place once and picked up that quote. You gave some of your best years as a professional at NBC, and we talked about this off the air once, and you covered the big stories, and then suddenly you're not there anymore. CBS picked you right up.
Thankfully.
Was that particularly difficult after putting your life on the line? I mean, people give their lives to their companies, but your life was at risk, and then you go to work for CBS. Thank God this happened. But was that tough when NBC said we're going to downsize?
It's always tough when you lose a job, and this happened in December of 2008, right as the economy collapsed, and everyone said there will never be any jobs again. And then NBC laid off like 10% of their staff, and they basically closed their Dallas operation. But I've learned throughout my life in this career that good things come from getting fired. So you're never going to be happy when it happens. But a friend of mine lost his job about, 2 months ago, not in this business. And he came over and he was really upset, and he's like, I've got a wife and kids, and what am I going to do? And I'm like, celebrate, let's have a party because something great's about to happen. And he didn't believe me, but it has. So now when I talk to him now, a few months later, he can't believe how he was upset when he lost that job. So
I can share that because when that happened to you, it happened to me. I was working at a radio station for 9 years in Tennessee while I was doing this job, and they downsized. They cut out local, and I ended up landing here.
Right.
So it was the best thing that ever could have happened to me.
There you go.
The author of the book, Saved by Her Enemy, and the foreword is written by Ann Curry of NBC News as well. Ladies and gentlemen, CBS News correspondent Don Teague. Don's going to be signing copies of his book. We want to remind you, for those viewing as well as listening on radio too, that next week, Lise Wheel from the Fox News Channel will be here. She'll be talking about her new book and recent Supreme Court rulings and decisions and the changing courts in America. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for coming. On behalf of President John Johnson, thanks for coming to the President Speaker Series. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Good job.